We are studying the text where Sri Aurobindo synthesizes the various modes of the self in its manifestation, and rapidly he covers various philosophical and religious perspectives, extremes even of spiritual experience on which these perspectives are based, and gives us a comprehensive, integral perspective and resolution of these poises. In the paragraph we last read, he places before us the distinction between the moving surface form of the self as against the unmoving, unchanging, silent, immutable poise of the self, and above these two, the third poise, which is the highest. In the Bhagavad Gita, the Kshara, meaning mutable, Akshara, immutable, and Uttama, meaning highest, above. So, Kshara, Purusha, meaning person, but capital P, it is the station of consciousness as a person. Akshara, Purusha, unmoving, and then Uttama Purusha, the highest. So the theme here in this paragraph is the distinction between these two and their resolution in the third. Our mind is part of this surface mutable formation, and as long as it is a part of that, it is always stuck in the movement of change. It does not have the peace self-existent, or the delight which is self-existent, or the silence and the pure consciousness of existence. On the other hand, if we step back, interiorizing ourselves from our surface personality and go to our deeper, immutable poise of personality, there we have the silence, actionless, equal, unchanging self, and we have the delight, which is pure, constant. The consciousness, force, and delight is there. But in that poise, we cannot act, we cannot enter into the movement. So it is as if these two are in contradiction to each other. The surface moving person is possible because there is the silent, static base behind. The static base does not need the movement. But without the movement, the static is as if not known as static. It needs something to contrast with. So we see a kind of a subtle interdependence, even as it appears as if these two can never be reconciled because they are the very opposite of each other. And so the resolution that the Bhagavad Gita offers, he says, the Gita makes a distinction between the three Purushas who constitute the whole state and action of the Divine Being, the mutable, the immutable, and the highest, which is beyond and embraces the other two. And he says the mental being is fixed in the mutable, does not have possession of an eternal peace and power and self-delight. The soul fixed in the immutable holds all these in itself, but cannot act in the world. But the soul that can live in the highest enjoys the eternal peace and power and delight and wideness of being, is not bound in its self-knowledge and self-power by character and personality, or by forms, or its force and habits of its consciousness, and yet uses them all with a large freedom and power for the self-expression of the divine in the world. And this is the thing which we briefly read, but I said we will discuss in greater detail. This resolution of these two poises in the third poise, which gives you the fullness of both, is the thing we want to dwell upon today. In Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, essays on the Gita, he dwells upon this in an entire chapter. And the chapter is quite extensive, very detailed, not only looks at the relationships between these three Purushas, but also discusses the means by which we are to develop, to shift our consciousness, to enter the third poise. So we will read from a few portions from there, only to gain some deeper understanding and clarity of these three, but not get too much into the means by which this is to be attained. The chapter is titled The Three Purushas, obviously, and here he says the whole discussion of the Gita is converging towards something, and he says this central thought to which everything is converging is the idea of a triple consciousness, three and yet one, present in the whole scale of existence. Now here he is setting a context within which we must understand the rest of the discussion. These three poises exist not only within us individually, not only in the universal appearance, manifestation of the cosmos, it is everywhere in the whole scale of existence. Anything you pick, within that you will find this triple poise. It can be an object, it can be a person, it can be a consciousness, it can be a level of consciousness, it can be a scale of consciousness, it can be a force, it can be an action, it can be an event. Everywhere, in everything, this triple status exists. Triple consciousness, three and yet one. And so that is the distinction we will come to later on. At first we will see these two separate, we might even see the third in some way as if separate, but we must realize they are essentially one consciousness with a triple aspect. So first he points out this circumstance here where the mutable consciousness exists. He says, and I'm going to read in portions, I won't even read complete sentences, I will skip in phrases as necessary. There is a spirit here at work in the world that is one in innumerable appearances. It is the developer of birth and action and the moving power of life. It is nature, which is power of the spirit, and objects, which are its phenomena of name and idea and form. But what we see obviously at work before us is not this eternal and his conscious Shakti, but a nature which is in the blind stress of her operations. Her work is a confused, ignorant, and limiting play of certain fundamental modes and qualities, principles of force. And whatever soul comes to the surface in her action is itself in appearance ignorant, suffering, bound to the incomplete and unsatisfying play of this inferior nature. So I've actually merged in my reading across several sentences, but the words were all from the text. So here is a very important idea. We have a power which is creating all this. Behind it is a divine power. On the surface it is an ignorant power, limiting, self-limited, operating through certain limited processes. At the moment you have a limited process through which it expresses with limited powers, anything entering that itself is bound to those limitations. So we may take certain analogies. If you are a spectator in a stadium, you have pretty much the freedom to do what you want. You can eat food, you can use your hands and legs. But when you enter the field where there's a football match going on, you are bound by the rules of that play. You cannot touch with your hands, you cannot stop and eat. You're entering a space where there is a limited condition prepared. So this is an example where the person is still free innately, but accepts to be limited in that. But a better example, more relevant to this, will be when we enter an environment which is itself limiting and limited. For example, you wear a spacesuit in order to step out of your spaceship. The spacesuit is itself made of stiff, rigid materials. It does not have the same flexibility as your fingers or your arms. It is fragile. It can be punctured easily. And when you put on this spacesuit and enter the domain of space, you cannot function as you would. You are bound by the material that you have entered. A still more accurate example now will be when the soul enters the material world. From its poise of freedom, from its consciousness, which may be vast, it now embeds itself in the physical body. It identifies its consciousness with what the physical biological consciousness is capable of expressing. And the mind fixes itself in the brain. And immediately there is a dulling, a narrowing, suffocating, stifling transition. All the energy and all the freedom that it had is rapidly narrowed and embedded in this as if substance of clay. Sri Aurobindo uses the term in Savitri, mud engine. So we have entered the mud engine and then we are suddenly bound in it. And as the consciousness now awakes from the stupor and grows over the years of our early childhood, we wake up inside this mud engine, identified with it, and we say, I am this body. And I am only capable of doing what my body appears capable of doing. And the identification there is so complete that we have even forgotten the entry point and the transition, or what was before the transition, except as a vague memory. Somewhere inside you feel, I need to be free. And so it takes on strange forms. You want to run away from difficult situations in life. You want to go out into nature. You want to stand at the top of a mountain, experience the wideness which reminds you of that wideness, and so on. But at this point, you have this example where an inferior nature will bind whatever soul emerges and enters into it. And this is where we are. The inherent power in her is yet other than what it does seems to be. Inside that nature is another power. For hidden in its truth, manifest in its appearances, it is the Kshara, the universal soul, the spirit immutability of cosmic phenomena phenomenon and becoming. One with the immutable and the supreme. So here behind this whole process and play is the cosmic spirit in its mutable station. We have to arrive at the hidden truth behind its manifest appearances. We have to discover the spirit behind these veils and to see all as the one. But this is the thing impossible to achieve with any completeness of inner reality so long as we live concentrated in the inferior nature. So you want to get to something else, but if you're stuck here, unable to disengage yourself, then you can only hope and wait. If in the Kshara, taken alone as a thing in itself, the mutable universal, apart from the undivided, immutable and the transcendent, there is no completeness of knowledge. If you just take this surface piece, there is no completeness of knowledge, no completeness of our being, and therefore no liberation. But then there is another spirit of whom we become aware and who is none of these things but self and self only. This spirit is eternal, always the same, never changed or affected by manifestation, the one, the stable, self-existent, undivided, and not even seemingly divided by the division of things and powers in nature. Inactive in her action, immobile in her motion. It is the self of all, and yet unmoved, indifferent, intangible, as if all these things which depend upon it were not self, not its own powers and consequences, but a drama of action developed before the eye of an unmoved, unparticipating spectator. This spirit is timeless. Though we see it in time, it is unextended in space, though we see it as pervading space. So now he is describing what it looks like when you turn from your changing surface consciousness to this other unmoving self. We are seeing a relationship. Against this flux, there is something which is unchanging. Against this sense of time passage, there is a reference of something which feels timeless. And so this transition takes place in 2 degrees. First, in our life, where we are still pretty much fixed on the surface. Every once in a while we get a knock. And the knock throws us back in a shock. And we look at, as if detached, we look at the stream of circumstances. And we say, what is this life? Why am I here? What do I really want to do? But the poise we have taken is not in the stream. It's not lost in the moment. And at that point, there is vaguely felt a sense of something like a permanence behind. A sense of something which is not in the flow of time. And yet, our main attention is on the flow of time. So this is the first level in which we are able to experience it. The second level, which is much more true, much more vivid, and more lasting, is when we consciously turn inwards and penetrate beyond this. And of course there are degrees, and as we go deeper, one experiences something which is completely still. And against that, the whole world seems to fade out, as if into some kind of first a drama, and then a kind of almost as if an unreality. So he says, and so then on the return, when we come back to the changing surface personality, we still feel the imprint of that, and that's what he is describing here. It is unextended in space, though we see it as if pervading space. We feel this vast silence, as if a backdrop of everything, filling everything. And so you can experience it while in the changing consciousness, as this backdrop, which is unchanging, or you can enter into it and be one with this unchanging backdrop, and then the surface layer is like a film projected on the surface, not so substantial. But both poises help support each other and bridge these two somehow. We become aware of it. Now the means. We become aware of it in proportion as we draw back from out inward, or look behind the action and motion for something that is eternal and stable, or get away from time and its creation to the uncreated, away from the phenomenon to being, from personal to impersonality, from becoming to unalterable self-existence. So 3 ways he describes by which from this surface changing consciousness we can experience this. First he says, in the turning inward, in proportion as we draw back from out inward. And this is generally what we do in certain kinds of concentrated practices of meditation. In exercise such as Vipassana, where you are asked to stand back and observe your sensations of the body. The focus is still outward, but because the poise taken is detached, there is a degree of interiorization. And the persistence of this for many days only fixes the poise of separation and may not by itself lead to anything deeper. But other forms of meditation where you actually turn within to seek for and concentrate your attention on the permanent or on the silence can take you much more rapidly and much deeper. So this is one process. Draw back from out inward. A second process, which is not an inward turn subjectively, which can be put in practice while you are in activity, with eyes open, with the 5 senses. Look behind the action and motion for something that is eternal and stable. So you start with a large space, open sky, vast ocean, top of a mountain, or lie down on your terrace and look at the sky, look at the stars. In that wideness, all activity and movement is felt smaller. So a bird flies, yes, there is a movement, but against a backdrop which seems static. You watch the ocean and the waves repeating unendingly the same pattern pretty much, and you sense the overwhelming presence of ocean itself as distinct from wave. Or you look out from the mountain top and this immense wide emptiness against which the little cars driving below, little people barely seen, and the wind at best rustling through will make a tiny movement. Everything becomes minute. The movements becoming minute, the static, unchanging surface is much more intense. And these are starting points through the senses, but eventually you have to break beyond the senses, where you try to begin to feel, sense something which is a presence, a silence, something maybe undescribable, and it grows more and more dense, more and more intense. And if you do this, once you get to the thing itself, not dependent on the sensory appearance, you can come back from the mountain and continue to hold this. Or you may even not need to go to the mountain. Sitting in looking out through your window, you watch the traffic pass, and you can put yourself in the poise and watch the stillness and silence behind. So this is the second way, which can be done with eyes open also. Third, get away from time and its creations to the uncreated, away from the phenomenon of being, from the personal to impersonal, from becoming to unalterable self-existence. And this is much more directly done by an inward concentration or an upward concentration, where you choose to get away from the world. This is the akshara, the immutable in the mutable, the immobile in the mobile, the imperishable in things perishable. So he's placing these two in their relationship as we experience it in life. While on the surface things are in this movement, at the core of it, as if inside or pervading it like an ether, is this immobile. Or rather, Since there is only an appearance of pervasion, it is the immutable, immobile and imperishable in which proceeds all the mobility of mutable and perishable things. So this comes to a third stage of the experience. While initially you are looking at or sensing a pervading, unchanging presence in the forms, you know really that the thing does not even pervade, because pervasion itself would involve a sense of expansion in space and time. That is only an appearance. That thing itself is unchanging, immobile, imperishable. And so when you concentrate exclusively on that, you experience that as something which is not just pervading, it simply is. And in that the movement takes place. And there's a reversal of the relationship. Where earlier you saw the immobile inside or supporting the movement, now experience movement as a superficial thing happening in a presence which is unmoving. So he has covered a series of experiences, all of which we may have as we proceed in whatever process we follow. And then he says, the Kshara spirit, visible to us as all natural existence and the totality of all existences, moves and acts pervadingly in the immobile and eternal Akshara. So in that immobile consciousness, non-moving, you're seeing all this. And then he discusses something very interesting. We won't go into it, but he describes the self-modifications of force and movement of energy in the 5 elements. This mobile power of self acts in that fundamental stability of self as the second principle of material nature, Vayu. With its contactual force of aggregation and separation, attraction and repulsion, supporting the formative force of the fiery, radiant, gaseous and electrical and other elemental movements, ranges pervadingly in the subtly massive stability of ether. Now, in just this one sentence straight away opens us to a whole deep insight. He's linking to another discussion which takes place elsewhere in several places. But the link is important. He's showing you how in that static consciousness, which may be described as an ethereal pervasiveness, come these further modifications by which movement emerges. Vayu, the air principle, Agni, the fire principle, and the further two. But what he's showing you here is there is actually a continuity between these two. There is the Akshara, eternal, immobile, that represents itself in a pervasive ethereal poise, which becomes the first element. It's not that, it's its representation. And then the air principle, fire principle, etc., all of which belong to the domain of movement. But you can see how the two have been brought so close through the 5 elements. And he discusses how it relates to our station of consciousness within us, which we skip. The difficulty which baffles our intelligence is that these two seem to be irreconcilable opposites, with no real nexus between them or any transition from one to the other, except by an intolerant movement of separation. When you observe the two in themselves, there's always a gap. Even if we take the earlier discussion about the ether, air and fire principles, between that immobile and the ether itself, there's a gap. Somewhere there has to be a gap. I have mentioned before in the Kashmir Shaivism, they have this very interesting description of how the Lord chooses to manifest himself. And as he's on the verge of manifesting, so all the intention and power to manifest, all the gathering can take place without the movement. But as he's on the verge of movement, he stops. Because if he moves, he will lose his poise of purity. And so he stops and instead releases his Shakti, his energy, his power. She moves. And so he can support her from his poise of purity. That stopping point is the closest you can get to something which is movement. But eventually there's still a gap. You come close enough, there's a point where either there's movement or there's no movement. And there's a schism. The Kshara, surface movement, acts, or at least motives action separately in the Akshara. The Akshara stands apart, self-centered, separate in its activity, separate in its inactivity from the Kshara. At first sight, it would almost seem better, more logical, more easy of comprehension if we admitted with the Sankhyas an original and eternal duality of Purusha and Prakriti. But of course, the Gita does not accept that original duality. It posits this highest station, and so we come to that. So, the Gita finds it. What is the principle of oneness? He says, the Gita finds it in its supreme vision of the Purushottama. For that is the type, according to its doctrine, of the complete and highest experience. It is the knowledge of the whole knowers. The Akshara, unmoving, is Para, supreme in relation to the elements and action of cosmic nature. So between the two, non-moving is superior. It is the immutable self in all, and the immutable self of all is the Purushottama. The Akshara is he in the freedom of his self-existence, unaffected by the action of his own power in nature, not impinged on by the urge of his own becoming, undisturbed by the play of his own qualities. But this is one aspect, though a great aspect of the integral knowledge. The Purushottama is at the same time greater than the Akshara, because he is more than this immobility. And he is not limited even by the highest eternal status of his being. So now comes the very important idea. Remember, we took this example from the Kashmir Shaivism. This poise before he moves. And Sri Aurobindo is referring to that in passing. Not impinged on by the urge of his own becoming. The urge itself is there. Even that does not affect him. That's the poise he takes in the unmoving. But from there is a still higher poise in which this limitation is exceeded. In this, you cannot move, you cannot act. You are as if bound to that status of inaction. So the highest of this is the Purushottama. Still, it is through whatever is immutable and eternal in us that we arrive at that highest status, from which there is no returning to birth. But when pursued through the Akshara alone, this attempt at liberation becomes the seeking of the indefinable, a thing hard for our nature, embodied as we are in matter. So now we have taken two steps. One, stepping out of the changing to the freedom of the unchanging. Stepping out of the unchanging to the highest freedom, where you are free even from unchanging. But from the unchanging, silence, when you turn to that, how do you describe something which is beyond? Undefinable. I, who am now living in the surface moving consciousness, look at the unchanging and then look beyond and undefinable. How do you describe it? Beyond comprehension. As a supreme unmanifest. So, now the correction comes. But yet is he more even than the highest unmanifest akshara, more than any negative absolute, neti, neti, not this, not this. Because he is to be known also as the Supreme Purusha, who extends this whole universe in his own existence. Now he completes the circle. It is the supreme, mysterious all, and ineffable, positive absolute of all things here. He is the Lord of the Kshara, of the changing. Purushottama, not only there, but here. So not only from the silence you see this highest, but from the movement also you can relate to the highest. And what is that relationship? You come to something very different. But here in the heart of every creature, Ishvara, Lord. And there too, even in its highest eternal status, he is the Supreme Lord, Param Ishvara, transcending Lord. No aloof and unrelated, indefinable, but the origin and father and mother and first foundation and eternal abode of self and cosmos and master of all existences and enjoyer of ascesis and sacrifice. And so here we come to a very different relationship. From the silence you relate in one way as something unknowable. From here, from movement, you relate to him as the Lord of the movement, who is at the heart of the movement. How do you get to know him? It is by knowing him at once in the Akshara and the Kshara. It is by knowing him as the unborn who partially manifests himself in all births and even himself descends as the constant avatar. It is by knowing him in his entirety that the soul is easily released from the appearances of the lower nature and returns by a vast and sudden growth and broad immeasurable ascension into the divine being and supreme nature. For the truth of the Kshara too is the truth of the Purushottama. So here is the other way. We are now seeing two different ways. One way which is a positive way, affirmative. Another way which is a negative way, which says not this, and negation. But both converge to the same one Lord. The Purushottama is in the heart of every creature and is manifested in his countless vibhutis. The Purushottama is the cosmic spirit in time, and it is he that gives the command to the divine action of the liberated human spirit. He is both Akshara and Kshara, and yet he is other because he is more and greater than either of these opposites. So this is the way he leads us to this completeness of the highest Purusha. There is much more in the text, many pages more, where he discusses the various means of approach. But already in what we have read, it should be obvious that if we approach the highest station from the movement, from within the movement as conscious beings, and he is the Lord of our heart, then the way to him would be through the heart, through the devotion, through the love for the divine, and through consecrated service in life. Whereas the way through the silence would be a different approach, where we disengage from all these movements and activities and go into a kind of a pure essential towards that poise which is free. So we can see already here some kind of a connection between the way of works, the way of devotion, and the way of knowledge itself can take a double poise. It can be through the movement on the surface or by a withdrawal from the movement into the silence and thence to that. So Sri Aurobindo refers to this in the next paragraph where he is discussing something else, which is the distinction between the divine manifesting quality and the divine which is without quality. So he says here, and I'm skipping the paragraph in the next. He contains all in his absolute capacity. He is free from them in the sense of exceeding them, And indeed, if he were not free from them, they could not be infinite. God would be subject to his qualities, bound by his nature. The eternal is bound neither by quality nor absence of quality, neither by personality nor by impersonality. He is himself, beyond all our positive and all our negative definitions. So these lines we can bring into context here. If on the surface you have movement, or even in the depths you have movement eventually, but then you have an unmoving, immobile, he has to exceed both, because otherwise the immobile could not be perfectly immobile if he was only that. He has to be able to be both in order to be able to represent himself as the immobile as well as to be able to represent as the mobile, and yet free of both. And so such is the conception we hold. What does it mean in practice? And what does such a state of consciousness actually experience when it is now seated within us? And that's the text. We come back to the text we have just been reading. The soul that can live in the highest enjoys what? Both the poise of the static and the poise of the movement, but without the limitation of either. So he says, enjoys the eternal peace and power and delight and wideness of being. So this would be part of the static consciousness that is there obviously. But at the same time, all these movements which are there in the limitation of nature, those also it is able to enjoy, but in a different way. On the basis of this greater freedom, it is able to enjoy those. So, is not bound in its self-knowledge and self-power by character and personality, or by forms of its force and habits of its consciousness. So here remember, on the surface nature binds you in those bundles of her limitation. In our individual human consciousness, it is our character. What is character? The rhythms in which we have been bound by habit. Habit going back all through our life in our training, before our life through our heredity, before our life through past life imprints, and the foundation of, or the previous impulses of karma, all of which converge into this binding, limiting, compelling. Prarabdha is the term used. Karma is still a very specific aspect of it. A general term is prarabdha. Pra, before, arabdha, begun. Begun before. The things which were begun before, which are still hanging on. In our loose modern vocabulary, we will say baggage. The stuff you are carrying with you, which you are unable to let go, because it as if defines you and forms you. So there's so many aspects to it. The karmic bindings are only a small part of it. Things begun before is a more general term. And those are the things which form our character. And then we have our personality. The distinctive features within our character which make for me. So if you look at character, many of us may have in our character the tendency to get upset, to get angry, to get depressed, to have whatever normal human reactions of emotions or limitations of thought, where we fear the unknown and so on. Those are common. But the particular manner in which my distinctive personality expresses it, that is my personality. But again, if you think about it, it's still a rhythm of habit, which is familiar to me. So, not bound in its self-knowledge and self-power by character and personality, or by forms of its force and habits of its consciousness. So, my force has certain forms. According to the age, you can see how as a child, the force I have is of a certain type. As an adult, it has a different type. as somebody who has now reached great maturity both in age and in consciousness, the force and the manner is very different. Habits also similarly may undergo changes and refinements. But what are all these things, character, personality and force and habit, binding? Two things. They bind self-knowledge and self-power. Always what is being limited within me is the knowledge of who I am and the power of who I am. In other words, when I look at myself and say, I am such and such, I can do such and such, this is the self-knowledge and self-power. These are limited. I gave the example last time of this little baby lion who grew up as a baby sheep, brought up by the sheep, not knowing what his real potential and power within is, and so unable to actualize. But when you get a kick and something provokes, then instinctively what emerges is something already waiting, latent. But when our self-knowledge is, I am this incapable, limited, ignorant human being, then I behave as if I have no other means. When my self-power is my muscular strength, my strength of intelligence, and a little bit of vitality that I can throw around and push, that's all I have. And therefore this is all I can do in my limited sphere, then of course that's all I will even attempt to do. You will find in history, there are people who come, we call them vibhutis, because they do not stop with their human limitations. They aim at something which appears humanly impossible. And not only they aim at, but they are able to somehow bring into action a knowledge or a power which is more than their human personality. Sri Aurobindo has a very interesting sonnet where he pokes fun at the modern biological and psychological theories, where he says, I think it is the pineal gland which wrote Hamlet, or a stomach which is upset drives Napoleon. He puts in contrast the limitation of the machinery of our nature with the thing which comes through. So modern psychology even claims that a slightly unstable tendency in our mind, bordering on madness, is what we call genius, because we see the two associated so often. But it's rather, Sri Aurobindo explains, it is because the power of genius is so great and the mind containing it so small and weak that it tends to destabilize the mind. It's not an unstable mind which creates a genius. It's not an upset stomach which gave Napoleon his drive. Rather, the power that worked through the fragile instrument which destabilized the instrument when it acted with great intensity. And so we have to recognize the power of our self-knowledge and self-power. The deep thing is behind the instruments. As long as we identify with the surface part, we will never know that. But if we have the poise of the unchanging self, the immutable self, akshara, where we know that wideness, unbounded, and now we operate through this limited personality, then the self-power, self-knowledge can flow through, not bound by character, personality, form, or force and habit of consciousness. We are conscious of that full potential. We are able to wield it and even pour it through this narrow instrument. And if we find the instrument now getting a little destabilized, we are able to restrain it as necessary. Or restrain the instrument's destabilization while pouring the full intensity of the power for a while. Maybe in the process burning up some of the instrumentation. But then able to come back to rest and bring into it some kind of a rapid recovery and regeneration. Because you have that and this. And you're conscious of their relationship. So he says, not bound by all this. And then he says, and yet uses them all with a large freedom and power for the self-expression of the divine in the world. This is large freedom and power, using the surface personality and instrumentation for the self-expression of the divine in the world. This phrase is very suggestive. Large freedom and power. Because you are in your consciousness seated in something which is wide, which is large. Your consciousness being free, you experience its freedom. You are living in its freedom. Your consciousness having that wideness and the power in that wideness, you are that. And using the surface personality with this large freedom and power as necessary. In many cases, we know where the instrumentation was fragile. When the power flowed through, it had certain side effects. It even at times caused illness. This is surprising, and for many it is counterintuitive, because we have as if been taught that the spiritual consciousness will solve everything, it will heal everything, it will make everything perfect. And here what we are saying is the very intensity of the spiritual force pouring through the personality can cause illness. And there are several reasons for that. One obviously being the instrumentation has not been plastified and made ready. There are many ascetic paths in which from the very beginning our nature is taken only as a temporary container to be beaten into shape so that it does not bind us. Once we get free, we use it as long as necessary and then we discard it. In such cases, obviously because not enough work has been put in making the instrument itself perfect, there will always be some such side effect. In many vibhutis, this does happen because they are not conscious of their higher spiritual origin or mission always. In the case of the avatar, this may not be so obvious. And yet there will be problems because of two reasons. One is the immensity of the power brought, which can lead to the physical consciousness itself being unable to contain. And Sri Aurobindo discusses this in his Record of Yoga. He makes some observations of how when crossing a certain degree, crossing a certain threshold of intensity, it still leads to some reactions in the body, and he's working now to free the body even from that. And that's the reason why Sri Aurobindo insists on the foundation of peace and wideness first. As that peace is established and the consciousness made wide, all of these distortions can become reduced and even eliminated when the consciousness becomes as wide as the infinite and founded in the peace entirely. Examples of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, for example, receiving the downpour or perhaps a few drops of the Ananda, unable to contain and beginning to dance in a frenzy, singing in a frenzy, but radiating at that point that vibration of delight with such intensity that even people around him were, so to say, raised in its intensity and sometimes driven to frenzy because they couldn't contain. Sometimes even leaving an imprint in matter, when in that state of trance he would gaze at the Lord in the temple of Puri, Jagannath, his hand resting against the wall, we can still see in the wall as if the stone has melted and the hand imprint pushed into the stone. The intensity of that ecstatic experience overwhelming everything, including the things he touched, but unable to contain. But the same intensity other saints have had, but on the foundation of peace and wideness. And they would radiate it, impacting others. But because they radiated on the foundation of peace, others also were held in the peace and not overwhelmed and driven to that unstable expression. It is not to belittle the realization of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu or other such saints. But it was the nature of their path to not pay attention to the instrument, and especially the physical body, seeing it more as a burden and obstacle. Sri Aurobindo himself held such immense powers of the supramental consciousness. The mother, in 1960, the first anniversary of the supramental manifestation, she brought down something of the supramental power as much as was possible for earth to bear, and a certain aspect of the delight of the mother of Ananda. And strict instructions had been given beforehand that nobody should touch her. She would give the blessing packet, but from a distance, drop it in your hand, but nobody should touch her. And one man, foolishly, at the moment when she was giving the blessing packet, he reached out and made contact with her hand and instantly fell back in a swoon because of the overload he could not bear. But it was in such situations that because of the stupidity of human beings, she had to diminish the power to make it bearable. I also recall we had done some interviews with many of the old sadhaks and many interesting stories which came through them. One of them was a sadhak who lived across from Sri Aurobindo's room in the building opposite.
She moved upstairs, but she remained physically active, playing tennis.
I forget his name now. Mrityunjay. He lived across, and so if you opened his window, he would see straight through in Sri Aurobindo's room, through Sri Aurobindo's window.
More and more people came.
And he told us, Mother had instructed him, never look there. You must make sure not to look inside Sri Aurobindo's room. And he followed that. He was... one was, of course, an aspect of privacy, but there was another thing, which was the power which Sri Aurobindo embodied when he was working to establish the supramental consciousness in the most dense physical layers of matter and in his body. He could rise into it at will, but to bring it and fix it in the gross physical consciousness and its resultant transformation in the gross body itself, that was the work for which an enormous power had been brought into Sri Aurobindo's body. And therefore, during the period, even the personal attendants were told to be very careful. Where somebody had to go and clean Sri Aurobindo's room, he was told not to look at Sri Aurobindo even, to not disturb him in any way. And only after Sri Aurobindo's accident that some of these attendants had free access to him, and other things happened there. Because at that time, the whole nature of the focus had shifted. 1938, because of the Second World War, the focus had changed there, and the work which was being done had been interrupted by the accident. But until then, there was such an intensity. When somebody complained to Sri Aurobindo that between February Darshan and August Darshan, there is too much of a gap. Please have a darshan in between. Sri Aurobindo wrote back explaining that every time that there is a darshan, the work that he is doing is enormously delayed because he has to diminish the power to make it bearable for people to be able to see him and meet him. And so the work itself which is being done has to slow down and even be reversed or delayed for that purpose. And we realized there that in the darshan there was such an immensity, but it was modulated, it was limited to what people could bear. And even there, the experience people had was often that from person to person, there was the charge would as if intensify or diminish according to the capacity. In later years, this was obvious with the mother when she was meeting one after another so many people. But when Sri Aurobindo was giving the darshan jointly with the mother, it was so intense that for many people, in the first look, they did not even see Sri Aurobindo and the mother. Panditji's younger sister noted how when she first looked there, she said, "Where is Sri Aurobindo?" All she saw was this immense light, no form visible anymore. And so many people had experiences of that kind. And generally, after that first time stopped when you met. And so sometimes you had to have somebody nearby who would say, move on, poke you to move. But after that, often the impact would remain for several days and people would be in a certain daze, again depending on the receptivity. But in that one moment, it was as if he bore right through you. All the layers of your consciousness were revealed, opened up, and something was shifted fundamentally. You were not the same anymore. Just a brief impact, just a single gaze, and the work was done. But the power itself that he embodied was so intense. The people working with him often ended up developing instinctively a kind of a protective shell. Mother was asked, why is it that such and such a person, whose name we need not mention, being almost 24 hours with her, was so rude and so coarse in his behavior with people? And she explained that it was because the power around her was so intense that they could not bear it. The only way to be able to function in that was to create instinctively a kind of a hardened shell through which the power filtered through as much as they could bear. And so you see this coarseness in their behavior. She explained this of another person who had whatever limitations of his nature and coarseness. People were upset, and when one of the captains in the physical education program went to the mother and complained about him, mother said to her that, do you think a person who is next to me almost 24 hours is capable of doing wrong? Is capable of doing wrong? Because he was telling her to do certain things and she had a reaction of... And then she said, mother said to that captain, whatever he may say, you must obey. Now this was too much for her. And she, in a private moment, she said after that she would avoid going to him because of mother's instructions that she had to obey. And she knew that if he said something, she would have to obey, so she would avoid meeting him. The point though was, although there's this shell, hardened shell, something in the center of the being was worked upon to such a degree that the person could not do something inherently wrong. Of course, in the form of it, there are distortions, and we discussed why. But all of this is only to explain that the power can pour through or even build around the instrument without damaging the instrument if this preparation has been made in the instrument. If it has not, then in pouring through it can burn or it can overwhelm or sometimes destabilize, as in the example of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. On the other hand, there's another aspect. As the power flows through and engages with matter and the world, there is an exchange. There is a give and take. And there are things which come upon the instrument from others with whom there is a contact, which may harm. And so Mother comments on this when she says that a lot of the difficulties her body has to struggle are from the falsehood in people around or in the things she takes from people. But this, she said, is unavoidable because if she has to give, the passage is open to give, then there is always some exchange, something that comes in. In one instance, which was narrated to us by one of her attendants, he saw the mother, well, it might sound strange, she killed cockroaches with her hand because, well, it had to be done. In another place there was bird droppings, she wiped it off with her hand, and this attendant said, Mother, don't do this, I will do it. Mother said, no, don't worry, I clean greater filth in people's hearts. In consciousness terms, imagine when you look inside a person and you see the clutter and the junk. Well, if we look into ourselves, we can find, if we go deep enough and if we're honest enough, there's so much filth. And it's hidden from us neatly. We create a very nice surface space which is nice and clean and safe, and we can look at it and say, oh, I'm such a nice person. But when you really go into especially closer to the physical consciousness and the substance of our nature, there's so much filth. And I've mentioned before here, one of the experiences which I had once introspecting like this. At one point it was as if I'd opened the septic tank and it was filth so basic in the very substance of human nature, and it was universal, it was everywhere in all beings. It's the substance out of which our bodies and our personalities are made. But the stench of it and the filth of it was so overwhelming. I said, this is impossible, I cannot do this yoga. And that's when it hit me, oh yeah, I cannot clean it up, only she can clean it up. But that's the kind of thing which is there in us. Of course, it has to be taken layer by layer, bit by bit, gradually. But at times when necessary, the mother would have to swipe through and wash out, clean out all that. By what? Not the physical hand. It's her consciousness. Call it subtle hand if you want. But you don't need a hand. It's a movement of her consciousness. It's still her consciousness. So for the physical hand to clean the physical bird dropping is nothing compared to the consciousness which entering and washing that out has to touch it, enter it and deal with it. The imprint of it remains. And Mother explained it is possible by concentration to burn it out, wash it out within herself, whatever imprint remains. But she didn't have enough time, she said, because there was, especially in later years, such a burden of meeting people. And she knew in the balance, the line that she had to draw on what was important, and always indulgent to people's requests. But this I'm pointing only to explain how even in a purified instrument, there can be this second aspect of the mixture that comes, which can bring with it certain tendencies which may lead to certain forms of illness in the outermost layers. Yes. 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 Yes, they created instinctively, not consciously. It's like this, if you are walking on hot roads barefoot, after a while your skin will become thick and coarse, right? It happens automatically. The body does it. The same thing happens emotionally. Children who grow up in broken families or where parents are constantly quarreling or alcoholic, on some level they harden themselves emotionally to be able to deal with that. Something similar takes place, which, strange to say, is on a psychological level, but the part of the psychology that opens to the spiritual. On that layer, the intensity, the pressure is so great, one kinds of bunkers down or something, a kind of a coarse layer forms just to reduce and filter the intensity of the pressure. So it happens, they may not themselves be conscious. So all of this is only to elaborate on something here, which is the relationship of a consciousness now having the free access of its full self-knowledge and self-power, and yet able to work through the character, personality, form and force of habit of its consciousness, using them all with a large freedom and power for the self-expression of the divine in the world. And so this is the nature of the person seated in the highest poise of consciousness, knowing both as aspects of itself. So we reread this line and you can get a better sense of the full picture. It's actually 3 sentences with semicolons. The mental being fixed in the mutable moves in its flux, and has not possession of an eternal peace and power and self-delight. The soul fixed in the immutable holds all these, that is, peace, power and self-delight, and can live in the highest, enjoys the eternal peace and power. The soul fixed in the immutable holds all this in itself, but cannot act in the world. Okay, so we have these two. And then, but the soul that can live in the highest enjoys the eternal peace and power and delight and wideness of being, is not bound in its self-knowledge and self-power by character and personality, or by forms of its force and habits of its consciousness, and yet uses them all with a large freedom and power for the self-expression of the divine in the world. Here again, the change is not any alteration of the essential modes of the self. These three modes still exist. They have not changed. But consists in our emergence into the freedom of the highest and the right use of the divine law of our being. So our consciousness now is neither fixed and stuck in the mutable, nor fixed in the immutability and its silence, but from the station of the highest, it is aware of both poises as itself and uses them rightly with a full freedom. So this, I think, gives us reasonably some sense of what the nature of this experience is like. I am at the same time founded in that vast peace, silence, equality, unchanging, timeless, spaceless, and at the same time I pour through this changing flux of surface personality freely. I have both. I'm bound to neither. That's the nature of the experience. So it is this station which the Bhagavad Gita recommends for us, and you can see how the path of bhakti and karma, which is involving itself in the action, in the mutable, can enormously help to build that side of the bridge. And the aspect of the Jnana Yoga, which involves in separating oneself and establishing oneself in the silent self, thence opens out also to the same. And it's as if these three together would give you the double movement, connecting and ascending into the highest station, doing both aspects in continuity. So for the rest of the practice and the aspects of the practice, you can see that particular chapter in the essays on the Gita. So with this paragraph, he has reconciled this double status of the active self and the silent self. Immediately from here, the question arises, does it apply equally on a universal level? The active and the inactive are differentiated by the expression of qualities of the self now, because we see this also manifests the highest, as the silence also manifests the highest. So here are the qualities of the highest manifested, but in the silence it is the quality less which is manifested. And so the next paragraph takes up this discussion of Brahman, now taking the full scope of the manifestation, not just the individual subjective experience, but Brahman manifesting as quality, as world, or as without quality. And then a poise above, which is both, or transcends both. And with it comes also the aspect of personality and impersonality, which becomes the theme of the subsequent paragraph after. But you can see they're all related. At this point, I want to pause and share with you a profound teaching which comes from a Buddhist master. His name was Mahaghoshananda. Great Ghosha announcement, is it? Great or loud announcement and delight of announcement, revelation or Ghosha is announcement as if revealing something massively. So Ananda is delighting in that great revelation or great announcement. That is the meaning of the name. The man himself, he was a Cambodian. During the Khmer Rouge terrorism, we call it, his entire family was butchered in the most horrible way. 70 people. He was the only one who survived. A Buddhist monk, went through immense suffering. They were jailed, harassed. The Khmer Rouge very simply picked anybody who wore specs and killed them, because it meant they were studying, they were reading, they had knowledge. Knock out anyone who has knowledge. All teachers, all professors of any tradition, even school teachers and university teachers, everybody was just killed. He survived as a Buddhist monk, and after that he went around the whole country, unifying the country, spreading the ideal of Buddhism, compassion, love. In spite of the immense suffering he went through, he was always spreading an extraordinary presence of happiness and peace. All those who I have met who were his disciples or who had met him even briefly, they were all praised for what they experienced in his presence. Mahaghoshananda was visited the US in one of very rare travels. And so this person who narrated the story, she was a Christian nun, Catholic nun, and she narrated the story. They were in a conference for 3 days, during which not once he spoke, not a single word, not even give me water, nothing. He just sat there, beaming, smiling, and radiating this joy and peace. And that was all. And it was big, round body. And at the end of the conference, the organizers announced that Mahaghoshananda is going to give a teaching this evening on self and non-self. Oh, this is great, because that was part of the conflict, in the Buddhist tradition, because the Buddha said, An-Atman, non-self. And so straight away the Buddhist tradition rejects the Vedantic tradition or Advaitic tradition, which speaks of Atman, self as capital S. But the Buddhists say, no, that's not our way. Our way is not self. So it is approaching the more negative Vedantic practices of neti, not this, not this. But nevertheless, if one goes deep enough, one does not see a real conflict. But so there's always this problem among scholars. And so he was going to give a teaching. So everybody went there. And he met them not in the conference hall, but in the cafe. He was not a formal man. And in the cafe, he was sitting at his table. All the great scholars of that conference gathered before him. And he put before him the salt shaker and the pepper shaker. So now, ready for his lecture. And he put forward, dramatically, the salt shaker. Self. First word he spoke in that conference. No self. Moved the pepper. Then, exchanging both. Non-self. Yes, said. And all of them watched him, and they all said, no. Said, okay. Took it back. Again put self. Yes. Not self. No self. And that was it. And he gave a broad smile. It was a profound teaching. And so this nun said to me, she was narrating, she said that at that time they were all frustrated because they expected some grand lecture with the mind engaged. But what he projected was actually much more profound. And she said, I have to learn to be able to give a lecture with so simply and so briefly. But the message stayed with her. And it was, I think, 20 or 30 years later that she narrated this in one of the meetings that I was present at. But now, because it is conveyed with such simple, symbolic representation, it can be experienced, appreciated, absorbed on many levels. At the level at which we are most ready, this will convey a message, a meaning. But if we dwell upon it and go deeper and deeper, you will find it will get you to something even more profound. And so I'm going to try with words to try to convey some of these layers of perception of the same very simple teaching. White light is revealed. So the salt shaker, I am conscious, I am me. The black pepper, dark, unseen. You do not know from the surface light, and yet it exists. It knows itself, but to the light outside of the mind, that is dark. So, not self. The silence, emptiness perhaps, whatever word you use, unmoving. And so for the moving light, which needs movement to see, this is dark. The blankness of the silence of the self. Seems blank from there, maybe the rivers. But then, this and this are both equivalent. They're together, they're equivalent, the same size, the same importance, in relation to each other. To be free from both, reversing. You're bound to neither. This takes the place of that, that takes the place of this. You can represent it on many levels. You may say, reversal of consciousness. Now within me is the awakened consciousness. The world outside appears dark in relation to that. So, exchange. That's one way of seeing it. You can also see it in the yin-yang concept. Within this is that, within that is this. Remember what we read earlier? That in the movement, at the heart of the movement is the silence. The akshara, non-moving self supporting the movement. Or, as we also saw earlier, all this movement, remember, takes place supported by the unmoving, which is not an extension, it is pure unmoving consciousness. So it is in the unmoving that the movement takes place. So in the exchange, this is what you're seeing, these relationships captured. And maybe all of these ideas simultaneously. But at the same time, who shifts this? Who replaces this with that? In that itself, I stepped back one more level of freedom. In that freedom, both of these are equivalent poises. And in my consciousness, I can interchange them. I can see each inside the other and their relationship and their interdependence. And they are instruments. I can lift them, move them, and as instruments, work through both. And both are equally mine to express myself. Okay? So I've shared a kind of a meditation on this very simple representation of the teaching. But you can see how many different ways one could look at, and all of them are valid, or they are true. And together they lead you, by dwelling on them in meditation, into something which opens you deeper and deeper to a complete sense of the Uttama Purusha, the highest poise of consciousness, which is identical with these two. They are all three one, but triple in their expression. So maybe we can reread how he presented it right at the beginning, just 2 lines. Where Sri Aurobindo writes, the central thought is the idea of a triple consciousness, 3 and yet 1, present in the whole scale of existence. So, he is a supreme, mysterious all, an ineffable, positive absolute of all things here. He is the Lord in the Kshara. Purushottama, not only there, but here in the heart of every creature. Ishvara, Lord, enjoyer. And there too, even in his highest eternal status, he is the Supreme Lord, Parameshwara, not aloof and unrelated, indefinable, but the origin and father and mother and first foundation and eternal abode of self and cosmos, and master of all existences, and enjoyer of ascesis and sacrifice. It is by knowing him at once in the Akshara and the Kshara at the same time, at once. It is by knowing him as the unborn who partially manifests himself in all births and even himself descends as the constant avatar. It is by knowing him in his entirety that the soul is easily released from the appearance of the lower nature and returns by a vast, sudden growth and broad, immeasurable ascension into the divine being and supreme nature. Then he elaborates how our nature, Kshara, the changing surface movements that we see, although it is nature which is as if darkened, behind that is a divine power of which this is a lower operation. And it is in this movement towards that poise that we recover the higher nature. So now two things happen, two ascensions. One in the consciousness as we step back into the silence of the self and thence open to the highest, there is the liberation of our individual consciousness. The other, through the activity and movement on the surface, as we open out to the highest, there is the liberation of our nature. So the Purusha, poise of consciousness observing, and the Prakriti, the movement of nature, both are liberated. And they unite in the highest station, in the highest liberation, where you have a divine nature and a divine consciousness, and therefore a divine life, manifest in form. So this would be where we can pause for today. And next Friday we will take up the similar discussion on the qualitied Brahman and the quality-less Brahman and the nuances of that discussion. So too, in this experience of the self, one may return to a focus in this personality or in this particular aspect of the personality as necessary. Knowledge of the oneness of the whole is never lost. It may be held behind. It may be held behind to such a degree that for practical purposes I do not hold it anymore. For practical purposes I look out through this body, although I'm not bound to it, and I know I'm not bound to it, but I keep my focus here. Mother refers to this on certain occasions when in her work she was interacting with somebody in the ashram and discussing the work to be done in the coming days. And the person died a day or two later. And someone asked the mother, "Didn't you know that he was going to die?" She said, "There I know, here I withhold, so that I can be with them and deal with them as necessary for the work." Now this there and here, from our human perspective, we may think again as a split. But it's not a split. It is, the analogy would be as an adult. It's an example we have used many times. When you play with the child, you withhold your energy, your strength, your knowledge. You pretend to be of his capacity, of his nature, of his limitation, of equal interest, and play along. But at no point have you really lost your... It is a front in which you may be so immersed that it's as if you have set it aside, but it's never set aside. The mother had to do that many times. She said, otherwise it was difficult for people to feel her closeness. If she did not sit with you and go through a process of engaging in whatever you needed. Remember the description when an ambassador from some country came to visit the mother. It was almost a formal call because here is somebody who's head of a major institution. So as he came into the room, mother got up from her chair, stood up and shook hands, made him sit in front of her on a chair of the same height and size, and had a nice conversation of whatever it was that he was doing. And again she got up, shook hands, and he left. The next person might be a devotee who comes in and bows down before her and sits at her feet. But the nature of the interaction, she keeps at the level necessary in order to be able to engage. Many times we would see when first the person comes, she would be on a great height. And if the person found it too difficult to bear, she would immediately relax and come to that level. Children came, she would play with them as children. She would shift to the parents and immediately would be a different interaction. The power that she was pouring out would itself be modulated. Child comes, immediately the power is restrained and she's this very gentle, childlike playing. The child goes, somebody else comes, and the whole power may again flow with intensity as necessary. In another conversation, she records, it was in a class in the playground where she was commenting on Sri Aurobindo's text, The Mother, and on the theme of the mother. And she said, there's a question which you're supposed to ask, but nobody asked it. And then she said, I will tell you what the question is. Because just earlier she was saying the mother of Ananda can manifest only as the fit instrument. So the question was, why can't the mother of Ananda manifest through her? Because she was there as a fit instrument. And nobody asked it, so she herself raises the question and then answers it. And she says something extraordinary. She said, for the mother of Ananda, this body, she points to herself, is like any other. Its value is only in terms of the value given to it by the people around. And if that aspiration is there in the collective, then this body as necessary. Pointing to the need in the community to give to her body the necessary support through their aspiration and through the value they give to it. That power to manifest. Otherwise, she uses this phrase, this body is like any other. Meaning, the action of the divine can be through any body equally. It's specially developed for that action. As such, it is just another vehicle. They're all equally vehicles. A specially developed body would allow a more perfect manifestation. But the manifestation to take place through this body must require this body to be given the right place in the human consciousness. And it reminds one of another statement she made, which was in the later years. She said she would not need to leave her body if even one person in humanity who considered her body to be the single most important thing. And it is a sad evidence that she had to leave body, that there was not enough from humanity, even in one person who would want thing. But these are always human failings, inevitably, and it is the divine grace which leads us through these failings in spite of ourselves. We can take up any questions, yes. So the problem with the word witness self is that there are many levels of witnessing. So right now I can be a witness my own activity as my hands move. But who's watching my mind embedded in my brain, looking through my eyes, concerned with this little activity? That is still a witness, and that's good. There's another witness which steps back from all this and even steps back from my thoughts and watches my thoughts as a awareness that is not involved in thoughts. And this we would call the Manomaya Purusha, which is also Purusha, it is also witness, but poised in a quality of mind consciousness, still in substance of mind, and to that extent limited by mind itself. Within that, one can step back further and discover a vast, spaceless, timeless poise, which is a mental quality, but is not yet self. But when you break out beyond that, then we have the poise of the self, which is the ultimate witness consciousness, which is outside space-time and is not even bound to mind consciousness. It is a very different grade of awareness, pure awareness. So that would be the ultimate Purusha. But you have to recognize all of these are steps in between, but also in a sense they are reflections of that at each level of creation. Remember, this triple status exists everywhere. So in each station, there is a triple experience. So when I'm doing my work, there's a part of me that's embedded in the work, identified with it. There's a part of me which stands back and watches me as I'm doing the work and corrects where I'm doing wrong. And above, and there's a poise of me that can say, all right, this whole work should be stopped here or changed here or revised. It's completely free of both of these, isn't it? But it's a triple status in a very superficial way. What we're discussing here is the completeness of the triple status in its highest. Purushottama, in the way we are describing here, the idea of a supramental consciousness is not yet explicit. But we could say that the supramental has the station of the Purushottama automatically. The experience of a Purushottama can be had on many levels. Okay? So if we had it in a consciousness where you are experiencing at the higher levels of the mind, who is registering? It's still the mind consciousness at the higher ranges. And it's generally in that station that you experience the silence of the self. From there one can have this double experience and live in a kind of a liberated consciousness. But from there you will not be able to transform your nature. You'll be able to liberate it up to a certain extent and not more. But that poise can be had at a still higher station where the creative power of the divine moves to manifest. That would be the supramental. And when you have it there, then you will have the power to bring into and liberate fully your natures, including the most physical. So these are finer distinctions which this discussion is not getting into. Well, in the supramental that is implied. The supramental, because it is poised at the level from where everything emerges from there, including the station of the unmoving as well as the movement. It includes all that. But if we merely took the focus of Purushottama, we may or may not have taken it to its highest station. You may say Purushottama in its highest would be seated in the supramental. But one could have an intermediate poise and still experience this freedom. It's a fascinating discussion, and when we dwell upon it in this way, you can feel it has a very practical value. Even before we reach the experience of the silence of the self in its depth, we can experience the reflection of the silence of the self within us or around us. And already there a kind of a synthesis can be made and a poise of a higher Purusha experienced. And so we begin where we are, bit by bit, looking at both of these as complementary and then rising above. Each time rising above and rising above. If you look at it this way. Each time we reach deeper poise of the silence of the self, Each time we become aware of the deeper truth of the movement, not just the superficial part of it, but the Brahman as movement, Brahman as energy and power of movement, Brahman as static and silence supporting the movement. Each time we deepen that, we become higher reconciliation in the Purushottama as accessible from that experience. So I found the teaching of Mahaghoshananda very relevant for this passage, but it will apply equally to the further where we will have similar reconciliations. I managed to dig out the recording from that meeting just now, and I reheard the whole narration so as to be as accurate as possible. This is also to highlight that whatever the path may be, whatever the differences in vocabulary and priorities of a path, these essential experiences will be common because they are the nature of the divine reality and the manifestation. If in any path you go deep enough, and that's the real key, if you go deep enough, then you will get to these discoveries eventually. And you may use different vocabularies to describe them and fight over the words used, self or not self or non-self, Atman, Anatman. If you look at the experience behind, it is not, there is really no conflict. Oh.